The sixth time around, I decided I couldn't bear to watch it again, so I sat outside and listened. Again, I was left with the drama. Those two showings did much to bring home to me what was excellent in the film and what was poor. The camera work of James Wong Howe was very fine, and the acting of Newman and Miss Neal equally so. The camera was completely faithful to the beauty and pitilessness of the Panhandle. It showed what is there, a land so powerful that it is all but impossible to live on it pleasantly. Newman and Miss Neal took advantage of their roles as brilliantly as the camera took advantage of the terrain. Between them they saved what was otherwise a weak and badly shaped dramatic vehicle. The first time I saw the film, I thought the screenplay was superb. All I heard was the wit, and there is wit. By the third showing, I had begun to wince, and by the sixth it seemed to me clear that the screenwriters had erred badly in following my novel too closely. Horsemen Pass By has its moments, but they do not keep it from being a slight, confused, and sentimental first novel. The screenwriters had the good sense to shift the focus from Lonnie to Hud, but otherwise they were content to follow the book, and as a result most of the confusion and all of the sentimentality were carried over. Touches which were over-poetic in the novel became merely awkward in the screenplay. Occasionally, a line of description from the book would be turned into a line of dialogue, but with no change in the adjectives, a practice hardly recommendable. Worst of all, they chose to stick with the novel's faulty structure, which meant that old Homer collapsed as pathetically and unconvincingly in the movie as he had in the book. Still, I am grateful to the screenwriters for inadvertently pointing out to me where my story should have gone, and I am even more grateful to them for bringing home to me how careful one must be of the lyric impulse when writing about the Southwest. Prose, I believe, must accord with the land. The forests of East Texas reach to Yoknapatawpha. Someone like William Humphrey can occasionally get away with the Faulknerian density. For the West, it doesn't work. A viney, tangled prose would never do for a place so open, a place, to use Ross Calvin's phrase, where the sky determines so much. A lyricism appropriate to the Southwest needs to be as clean as a bleached bone, and as well spaced as trees on the Llano. The elements still dominate here, and a spare elemental language, with now and then a touch of elegance, will suffice. We could probably use Mark Twain, but I doubt we're yet civilized enough to need a Henry James. Since the movie was released, I have not been through the town of Claude. I imagine they have put the correct name back on the water tower, and now the name Thalia is on no water tower anywhere. In June, though, the thunderheads will still roll south across the J.A. and the Palo Duro, and in Claude and Clarendon, Muleshoe and Kittiquay, the old-timers at their whittling still tell stories of the old man, Charles Goodnight. The stories slowly alter, become local myths. Some remember that the Indians called him Buenas noches. They can tell the sad story of the last running about the ragged band of Comanches who came all the way from their reservation in Oklahoma to Goodnight's ranch on the Kittiquay to beg a buffalo of him. At first he refused, but in time he relented and gave them a scrawny young bull, thinking they would drive it back to the reservation and eat it. Instead, whipping up their thin, miserable ponies, they ran it before him and killed it with lances and arrows, then sat looking at it for a time, remembering glories and centuries gone. Such a story catches a whole people's loss, but only a few old men and a few writers tell it today, and the old men, for that matter, usually tell it as a story about the craziness of Indians. The old man has become a local god, his legends recounted in a few ranch houses, a few courthouses, and the domino parlors of a few West Texas towns. The old-timers and the cowboys know about him, but the youngsters of Texas don't. They know Hud, that keen, hard, attractive bastard who drives a Cadillac. Since the youngsters have never heard of the old man, they don't know that Hud is his descendant, and the few who know both are so partisan to the old man that they would adamantly deny that the two are related. But related they are, though they knew different times and put their powers to different uses. Before I am quit with Hud, I want to make the lines of relation a bit clearer. I might add that I should be embarrassed to talk so much about one of my own characters, particularly a none too successful character from an early book, were it not that the Hud I am talking about is essentially the creation of the film. Insofar as he has an archetypal or mythological dimension, he is not my creation, but relates to that myth of the Westerner which the movies themselves have helped create. The purpose of the section which follows is to relate that myth to the diverse rites from which it grew. Cowboys, Movies, Myths, and Cadillacs. An excursus on ritual forms in the Western movie. Number 2. Since Hud was made, I have often been asked if I think movies and television portray the American cowboy as he really is, or to be more accurate, as he really was. The people who ask that question not only expect me to answer in the negative, but also obviously hope that I will then take Hollywood to task for its irresponsibility. To them, realism is something more than a method. It is a moral imperative. Similitude equals truth equals art. That is, of course, a very low-grade aesthetic, but it is one that crops up all too often. In this day and age, everything is taken seriously, even the Western. People seem to want it to become a responsible genre. I suppose I am as fond of responsible genres as the next man, but I am by no means sure I want the Western to become one. Until I read Robert Warshaw's celebrated essay on the Westerner, I had been quite content to think of the Western as simply a mode of entertainment, a mode in which the only real things were the horses and the landscapes. I used Westerns as I might use the Maciste movies as a means of disengaging myself from life for a couple of hours. I am seldom in the mood to look down my nose at a cheap, convenient escape, and even seldomer in the mood to wonder whether the escape is art. The kind of escapes one chooses are significant, no doubt, but our culture offers such a variety now that one's curiosity about them is apt to be blunted. Years ago, when I still lived on a ranch, I used to notice that there was a certain lack of similitude in Hollywood's treatment of cowboy life, but at that time I couldn't have cared less. The cowboys I knew couldn't have cared less either. The only gaucherie I can remember them mentioning is what one might call the trotting cattle syndrome, a very recurrent screen phenomenon. The moviegoer usually sees cattle being driven across the screen at a pace so rapid that even the wiriest longhorn could not have sustained it the length of Hollywood Boulevard without collapsing. The trail herds of the 70s and 80s were grazed along at a sedate 8 to 10 miles a day. Anything faster would have been economically disastrous. Warshaw, of course, was right in pointing out that the working cowboy has never been very important in the Western movie. The gunfighter has been the central figure, and cowboys and gunfighters were very different types, neither very good at the other's specialties. A Western may start out with a cowboy hero, but 9 times out of 10 the plot will require him to learn gunfighting so that right may prevail. Recently there have been signs that this is changing, especially on television. Domestic Westerns have become very popular. Bonanza, The Big Valley, even, I should say, Gunsmoke. Whereas the best of the gunfighter series, Paladin, is seen no more. Neither, however, is Rawhide, the series which did the most with the working cowboy. Certainly, though, the effectiveness of the Western as a genre has never depended upon realism. The winning of the West is a romantic subject. Doing the cowboy realistically would have amounted to a sort of alchemical reverse English. It would have meant turning gold into lead. As a figure of high romance, the cowboy has remained compelling. He has outlasted the noble Red Man, Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, G.I. Joe, and any number of sports kings and entertainers. He successfully absorbed the figure of the pioneer, and with luck may even outlast acid rock. Still, the appeal can't last forever. The West definitely has been won, and the cowboy must someday fade. Indeed, a certain change has already taken place, and was taking place when Warshaw wrote his essay, 1954. If one can apply to the Western the terminology Northrop Frye develops in his essay on fictional modes, we might say that in the 50s the Western began working its way down from the levels of myth and romance toward the ironic level which it has only recently reached. Westerns like Shane, The Searchers, and Warlock are in the high mimetic mode, with the hero still superior to other men and to his environment. In The Gunfighter, this is not the case. We have moved to the low mimetic. Welcome to Hard Times is a recent example of the low mimetic Western. So, for that matter, is HUD, though it tends at several points toward the ironic. There are comparable developments in fiction. Thomas Berger's Little Big Man is a brilliant ironic performance. Its nearest cinematic equivalent is Cat Ballou, in which Lee Marvin won an Oscar for a role that parodies the gunfighter. No doubt high mimetic Westerns will continue to be made as long as John Wayne is acting. He wouldn't fit in any other mode. But in number they are declining, and the figure of the Westerner is gradually being challenged by more modern figures. At the moment, the secret agent seems to be dominant. In time, of course, we can expect to see the conquest of space, if we really conquer it, take over the place in the American mythos now held by the winning of the West. But that day has not yet come. If one agrees with Warshaw, and I do, that one of the reasons the Western has maintained its hold on our imagination is because it offers an acceptable orientation to violence, then it is easy to see why the secret agent is so popular just now. An urban age demands an urban figure. The secret agent is an updated gunfighter. James Bond has appropriated the skills of the gunfighter and added urbanity and cosmopolitanism. Napoleon Solo and Matt Dillon both work for the betterment of civilization. but the man from Uncle makes the marshal seem as old-fashioned and domestic as Fibber McGee and Molly. In the former, the violence, besides being aestheticized, has been brought into line with the times. If only there are some bad Indians out there in space, on a planet we need, then eventually the spaceman's hour will come. The cowboy's golden age was the last third of the 19th century. In treating the golden age, Hollywood has been fairly effective, but what happened in the West after that age ended has so far barely been touched. The pictures which deal with it most directly are Hud and Lonely Are the Brave. Hud, a 20th century Westerner, is a gunfighter who lacks both guns and opponents. The land itself is the same, just as powerful and just as imprisoning, but the social context has changed so radically that Hud's impulse to violence is turned inward on himself and his family. He is wild in a well-established tradition of Western wildness that involves drinking, fighting, fast and reckless riding and or driving, and of course seducing. The tradition is not bogus. From the first, the cowboy was distinguished for his daring and his cheerful indifference to middle-class values, and if present-day cowboys are more solidly middle class than their ancestors were, it is because their range is now gone, and middle classness is all but unavoidable. Cowboys know it and comment on it in tones of regret. "I'm getting spoilt," they say ruefully, discussing some new softness their wives have got them to adopt. The tone is always joking, but it carries a sense of loss. How many years before they journey from their comfortable reservations in the suburb to beg of some old man a symbolic buffalo? Hud, of course, is not simply a cowboy. If he were, he could never afford the Cadillac. The Cadillac is his gun in a sense, and it is a well-chosen symbol. One might note that the two best movies about the mid-20th century cowboy both end with the death of animals. The two Longhorns in Hud, and the mare Whiskey in Lonely Are the Brave. Whiskey, most appropriately, is run over by a truck. It is trucks, not horses, that move cattle from Texas to Kansas these days. The men of the West once related very strongly to animals. Roy Bedicek treats the subject beautifully in Adventures with a Texas Naturalist. Now they are beginning to relate to machines. We see Hud on horseback only twice. We think of him in the Cadillac, a machine which has a dual usefulness, just as the gunfighter's gun once had. It is both a symbol of status and a highly useful tool. But Hud is a rancher, not simply a cowboy. The cowboy could no more afford Hud's car than he could afford Hud's women, though the latter might vary considerably in expensiveness. Indeed, there has always been an element of asceticism in the cowboy's make-up. His binges seldom provide more than a night's relief from the hard, Spartan conditions of his life. Along with the asceticism go pride, stoicism, directness, restlessness, and independence, all characteristics which the cowboy expresses through his own astringent humor. This humor has seldom been touched either in fiction or on the screen. Hud's wit was closer in idiom to the hard-boiled Dick than to the cowboy, and in westerns this is generally the case. The cowboy's temperament has not changed much since the 19th century. It is his world that has changed, and the change has been a steady shrinkage. There are no more trail herds, no more wide-open cattle towns. no longer that vast stretch of unfenced land between Laredo and Calgary. If the modern cowboy is footloose, there is only the rodeo circuit, for most a very unsatisfactory life. Rodeo was given one excellent low mimetic treatment, The Lusty Men, 1952, but except for Stony Burke and the rodeo sequence of The Misfits, has hardly been touched since. The big western ranches are gradually breaking down into smaller and smaller ranches, and with the advent of pickups and horse trailers, it is no longer necessary to spend weeks on the roundup. The effect of this has been to diminish the cowboy's isolation, his sense of himself as a man alone. From solitude and the clarity solitude sometimes brings, he is being drawn toward the confusions of the urban or suburban neighborhood. Also, unhappily, the cowboy's life is umbilically joined to a dying mother, the American range cattle industry. I think again of Hud and Old Man Goodnight. If the old man were Hud's age today, what would he do? He might make a fortune, and he might achieve something great, but he wouldn't do either with cattle, not unless he chose to go to Australia or Brazil or the Argentine. If the old man were ranching now, the frustration it would entail might cause him to waste his force in the same ways Hud wastes his. And Hud, given a frontier, might become a Charles Goodnight. The cowboy's gradual metamorphosis into a suburbanite is not without its element of paradox. The living conditions that make the wild, free cowboy such an attractive fantasy figure to those already urbanized will eventually result in his being absorbed by his audience. In a sense, this has already happened. Nobody watches TV westerns as avidly as cowboys. Even in his golden days, the cowboy lived within the emotional limits of the western movie and the hillbilly song. It was not pure frivolity that prompted me to appropriate Gilbert Murray's title for this chapter, but the belief that the central motifs of the western movie relate to the simple pantheism of the cowboy and the rituals of his life in a way that makes the appropriation valid. Most central of all, I think, is the ride, and the sacramental relationship of man and horse, matters which I will return to later. For the moment, it is enough to observe that Hud is one of the many people whose capacities no longer fit their situations. He needs more room and less company, and is unlikely to get either. In West Texas, a cow needs 20 or 30 acres of range to keep her nicely, and that's range at its best. Human generations will be needing those acres someday. The ranches will shrink to California size, and the cattle will be raised in feed lots, 30 head to the acre, meals around the clock. The descendants of the trail hands will be driving beer trucks in the suburbs of Fort Worth, Dodge City, Cheyenne, and a score of other cities whose names once held a different kind of promise. The cowboy's humor, for those who have not been exposed to it, is a humor of aphorism, of ironic understatement. One should then be especially careful not to overstate his decline. The passing of the cowboy's day has produced personal tragedy, of course, but collectively his decline has been merely poignant. Compare it with that of the Indian, for example. Almost any suburb looks good if the alternative to it is an Indian reservation. The cowboy has been diminished, but the Indian was destroyed. The great homeward march of the Northern Cheyenne in 1878 is a subject for a Sophocles, and was lucky to draw even a John Ford, Cheyenne Autumn. The Cowboys' trouble will take a lighter handling, of the sort it is getting now. In time, Hollywood will grow tired of parodying the gunfighter, and the ironic will yield to the mythic again. The Italian-made Clint Eastwood films, A Fistful of Dollars and sequels, mark already the reappearance of the archetype. Hud may leave the ranch forever and become an executive or an astronaut, but Gary Cooper will be back, perhaps as he was in The Plainsman, a figure of romance as remote and appealing as King Arthur. For a more instructive look at the methods by which the myth of the Westerner is being made usable to the artist, one should have to turn from the film to literature. Filmmakers seldom own themselves. Many might like to be serious, but few are. Ultimately, the Western is not a responsible genre. Within the last 25 years, the writers of the West have done more with the mythic materials than filmmakers have done, though unfortunately the work of most Western writers reaches only a limited audience and has only a limited impact. The film, if only because of its distribution and the power it achieves through pure repetition, continues to carry the myth to the mass audience. An investigation of the recent literature of the West is beyond my competence, but I would like, before I quit the subject, to relieve myself of a few opinions about the literature of my own state. Southwestern Literature, Number 3. Terry Southern is quite clearly the best writer ever to emerge from Alvarado, Texas. But is it possible that the Lone Star State inspired Candy? I fear not. Catherine Ann Porter was born in Indian Creek. Can we then take credit for her better stories? I think not. Let those who are free of Texas enjoy their freedom. The books I am interested in investigating are native in the most obvious sense, set here, centered here, and for the most part written here. I see no point in going back beyond the 30s. Anything earlier than that would be pioneer architecture, literary sod houses, so to speak. A few might be reasonably well chinked, but the majority are as leaky as sieves and about as uninteresting. It is appropriate, indeed inevitable, that a critique of Texas letters begin with the work of the Big Three, Roy Bedicek, W.P. Webb, and J. Frank Dobie. I wish it weren't inevitable. I had just as soon avoid it. The world outside never heard of Bedicek, hasn't read Webb, and isn't particularly interested in Dobie. The world inside doesn't read much and doesn't read well, but the three men were loved and honored here. Their merits as men were long ago confused with their merits as writers, and quite understandably. Their merits as men were exceptional and easily perceived, and few of the people who loved them had any skill in judging books. They were paid every homage but the homage of acute attention. Such criticism as they probably got from one another, for during the years of their prime, there was no reviewer in the state with either the guts or the insight to say them nay. Now they are dead. They have had a whole book of eulogies, but no elegy, and something rather sad has happened. Three men who disliked establishments have been made into an establishment posthumously, and local belles-lettrists are hard at work seeing that their memories are potted, pickled, and preserved. Not long ago I attended a meeting of the Texas Institute of Letters, the first meeting I had been to since the deaths of Dobie and Webb. During the afternoon, there was a panel discussion held in one of the grim ballrooms of the Driscoll Hotel in Austin. Our subject, equally grim, was, "What is the Texas Institute of Letters?" A glance around the room would have been sufficient to dispose of the question. We were a regional writers' club. Some of us were a little less minor than others, but none of us were causing any tremors in Stockholm. Some of us were a little less minor than others, but none of us were causing any tremors in Stockholm. Only the representative from Dallas, Mr. Lon Tinkle, took the question to heart. He suggested, not without eloquence, that we should regard ourselves as a sort of Southwestern affiliate of the Académie Française, a suggestion that drew sweet sighs from his admirers and a muffled horse laugh or two from members less Gallic in spirit. As the afternoon inched toward its close, I noticed over and over again the name Pancho being tossed into conversations. Sometimes it had to be tossed a considerable distance. It was Mr. Doby's nickname. Well, I thought, he was a very winning man. Probably all these people were his friends. Mr. Bedachek and Dr. Webb came in for frequent and reverent mention too, but Pancho was a word the mere utterance of which conveyed a sort of literary status. By dinner time, people were intoning it as if it were the password to heaven. Sanity seemed to be receding from the Driscoll. The president-elect of the Institute introduced the dinner speaker, Wallace Stegner, as if he were Shakespeare reincarnate, leaving Mr. Stegner numb with embarrassment at the podium. After the speech, prizes were doled out, the Trinity was invoked a few times for good measure, and the meeting closed. If I could have summoned one of the great departed for the evening, I would have summoned Mr. Bedachek. He wrote a good book on smells, and could have fittingly described the odor of sycophancy that pervaded the Driscoll that day. After the meeting, in preparation for this book, I read the three men, that is, I read their books, 29 in all. That I had not read them sooner is perhaps not as surprising as one would think. I grew up in a bookless town, in a bookless part of the state. When I stepped into a university library at age 18, the whole of the world's literature lay before me unread, a country as vast, as promising, and, so far as I knew, as trackless as the West must have seemed to the first white men who looked upon it. It behooved me to locate Homer, Shakespeare, and the other major landmarks scattered through the stacks. My own backyard could wait. I soon realized that some of the major landmarks were mountains I felt no desperate eagerness to climb, and in time I saw that the exploration of that country would be one of the day-to-day pleasures of a lifetime. I might have turned at that point to the immediate terrain, but for various reasons I did not. I wanted to be a novelist, not a naturalist, an historian, or a folklorist. Technical curiosity led me elsewhere, and for a time I looked upon the three men with that immodest disdain which young writers so frequently reserve for their better established elders. Had I known the men personally, I would probably have read them sooner, but unluckily I seem to have been the only writer in the state who did not know them personally. I saw Doby twice, Webb twice, Bedachek not at all. I knew, however, that I would have to read them some day. They were the presences. Only in exile could one ignore them. In 20 years this will change, and a generation that did not know them as men will be free to treat them as one treats most citizens of the Republic of Letters, that is, to decide from their books alone whether to admire them or dismiss them. Now it is not so simple. The writer of my age who wishes to write about this state must relate himself one way or the other to the tradition they fostered, whether he reads the three men or not. The 29 volumes were long, the reckonings I make with them here very short. I distrust thumbnail criticism, but in this instance it is the only kind the context will admit. Perhaps it will do as a yardstick, a means of measuring the distance from where Bedachek, Webb, and Dobie stood yesterday to where I and my colleagues stand today. Bedachek the writer is as easy to like as Bedachek the man seems to have been. His achievement was modest, and in the best sense of the word, belletristic. The pity is that he spent so much of his life doing essentially menial academic tasks, and so little of it writing for publication. He was nearing 70 when he completed his first book, by which time his companions, Dobie and Webb, had each been writing for more than 20 years. Sentence by sentence, Bedachek used language better than either of them, yet the weight of their lives lies directly behind their books, while the weight of Bedachek's lies somewhere to the side of his. Of the three, he was the only one who could be counted a stylist. Webb's prose was utilitarian, careful, clear, and stiff in his early books, somewhat more supple in his last two. It could carry his dry, spare wit very well, but on the few occasions when he tried to make it carry his more poetic emotions, the result was unlovely. Dobie's prose is strong and clear at times, and at other times makes one want to grind one's teeth. Bedachek had a fine ear and a style that is clear, firm, and graceful. His prose accomplishes the crucial task of slowing the reader down and putting him in rhythm with the subject, which is almost always nature. He abhorred the hastiness of modern life, and a taste for the leisurely carried over into his prose. It slows the eye without slowing the mind. He demands that the reader take him at his own pace or not at all, and he enforces the demand the only way a writer can, with style. A naturalist, of course, must have style these days if he hopes to be read by any but the specialists. Interest in nature is declining, to say the least. Bedachek knew this and lamented it. Dobie and Webb knew it too, and they too lamented it. Indeed, the note of lamentation for nature despoiled is sounded so many times in the 29 volumes that it comes near achieving the opposite of its intended effect. After a time, one begins to wonder if man's divorce from nature is really as bad and as belittling as they make it out to be. Whether it is or no, we arrive immediately at the crucial difference between that generation of Southwestern writers and the generation that is developing now. Bedachek, Webb, Dobie, and their disciples revered nature, studied nature, hewed to nature. At their worst, they made a fetish of it. At their best, they drew on it brilliantly for context and metaphor. For my generation, the reverse holds, and will hold, I suspect, for the generations that follow. I doubt we could scrape up enough nature lore between us to organize a decent picnic. To the Presences, that could only be a damning remark. For them, nature was the real. Knowledge of it made a full man, and accord with it was the first essential of the good life. Well, to each his own. I spent more than 20 years in the country, and I came away from it far from convinced that the country is a good place to form character, acquire fullness, or lead the good life. I have had fine moments of rapport with nature, but I have seen the time also when I would have traded a lot of sunsets for a few good books. Sentimentalists are still fond of saying that nature is the best teacher. I have known many Texans who felt that way, and most of them live and die in woeful ignorance. When I lived in the country, I noticed no abundance of full men. Of course, one has to be careful not to mix terms, to confuse nature with country, and country with anything which is not the city. One can love nature without loving the rural way of life, a distinction which both Bedicek and Dobie sometimes lost sight of. For better or worse, the country has been despoiled. Life in the country nowadays usually means life in or near the small town, and the small towns do not enlarge one's character, they shrink it. On first reading, Bedicek appears to be one of those rare writers who can make the workings of nature interesting. A second reading corrects that impression. The appeal of his work is not informational at all. The appeal of his work is in the play of his mind. One does not read him to learn about the mockingbird, but to learn about Bedicek. Indeed, the more one reads him, the less inclined one is to think of him as a naturalist. In his best essays, he uses nature as a reference point from which to discourse generally upon life, and upon those things which most affect the quality of life, such as time and education. He was an old-style philosophic humanist, whose formal affinities are with Emerson, Thoreau, and very distantly, Montaigne. Adventures with a Texas Naturalist is the only one of his books one needs complete, but oddly and unfortunately, some of his most trenchant and best-informed writing is to be found in Educational Competition, 1956, his History of the University Interscholastic League. One is inclined to doubt that Bedicek would have claimed as much reading for himself as some of his friends have claimed for him. Like a sensible man, he read what interested him, and clearly not everything did. He shared with Dobie an aversion to 20th century literature, though in both cases the grounds for the aversion are somewhat vaguely stated. Both seemed to feel that the literature of earlier centuries possessed a superior vitality, but neither apparently bothered to read enough modern literature to allow them to argue the point intelligently. Dobie, in particular, was given to reckless fulminations against the modern. Some of his disciples have picked up the habit and will hardly trust themselves with anything later than Plato. Bedicek's form, of course, was the reflective essay, but he also had something of the anatomist in him. His last book, The Sense of Smell, 1960, is an anatomy. His theories on shitting, rumored to be original, were unfortunately never committed to paper. Had he started writing earlier, his sane, healthy eccentricities might have had more opportunity to manifest themselves, and Texas has long needed an eccentric with a good prose style. It has long needed an unsentimental historian, too, and came near to finding one in Walter Prescott Webb. The problem of sentiment has seldom been dealt with in discussions of the literature of this region, yet it is a central problem. Everyone who writes from Texas feels this has to be his own, his native land, and no one yet has had a soul so dead that it would allow him to write about the state unsentimentally. In the majority of cases, however, it is less a question of live souls than of soft minds. The tough-minded Texan is a rarity, and the tough-minded Texas writer all but non-existent. Webb observed as much himself toward the end of the Great Plains. There has been a tendency on the part of writers to mix a good deal of sentiment with their history of the West. Yet a few years later, in his preface to the Texas Rangers, he could not resist contributing to the mixture. With assiduity I have sought out the veterans and heard their accounts. Men in active service have given me their frijoles and bread and black coffee. They have suffered me to share their camp, ride their best horses, fire their six-shooters, and to feel the companionship of men and horses when the saddle stirrups touch in the solitudes. I have not been entirely successful in purging my own pages of this sort of sentiment, a fact the censorious reader will doubtless note. That is Webb being Dobie, or worse, Webb being a Texas Ranger. What a thrill it must have been for a humble professor firing a Texas Ranger's six-shooter. Fortunately, the passage is less typical of Webb than of Western sentiment generally. In his time, Webb was the nearest thing to a tough-minded intellectual that the state had produced, and he was also the only thinker of any importance that it produced. The West has produced many good books, but perhaps as yet no great books. The Great Frontier may be the only book by a Texan that could with any accuracy be called major. Webb was shrewd enough to locate, while young, a crucial subject, the effect of the frontier on Western civilization, and he applied himself to it with the sort of tenacity which had probably enabled his forebears to survive on the hard soil of West Texas. Intellectual survival in his time took about as much stay-with-itness as physical survival had taken a generation earlier. Webb's books vary in quality, but they fit together in the way a writer's life-work ideally should. His work had scope, continuity, and coherence, and it can be seen, I think, that the farther his work took him from the borders of his native state, the clearer and more effective he became, and the safer he was from the blurring effects of sentiment. The important books are The Texas Rangers, 1935, The Great Plains, 1931, Divided We Stand, 1947, and The Great Frontier, 1952. I list them in the order in which Webb conceived them. If they are read in that sequence, one can follow the gradual expansion of his focus as he moved from local to regional, national, and finally international questions. Two of these, The Texas Rangers and Divided We Stand, seem to me to be of secondary merit, the one flawed by hero worship, the other no longer of much pertinence. The other two remain substantial complementary achievements. The Texas Rangers is essentially his first book, though The Great Plains crowded ahead of it in order of publication. It is a flawed book, but by no means uninteresting. In criticizing it, I should make clear that I am no student of Texas history and do not presume to dispute Webb's facts. The flaw in the book is a flaw of attitude. Webb admired the Rangers inordinately, and as a consequence the book mixes homage with history in a manner one can only think sloppy. His own facts about the Rangers contradict again and again his characterization of them as quiet, deliberate, gentle men. In 1847, when the Rangers accompanied the United States Army into the city of Mexico, a sneak thief stole a handkerchief from them. They shot him. Another Mexican threw a stone, and they shot him too. Later, a ranger named Alsons was killed in a violent district of the city, and the Rangers shot 80 Mexicans in retaliation. Webb relates these facts without apparently considering that while they might be the actions of men who were quiet and deliberate, they are hardly the actions of men who can accurately be called gentle. His most glaring whitewash, however, occurs in the chapters in which he describes the career of Captain McNelly, a ranger's ranger, and a man whom Webb seemed to admire above all others. In one of his least fortunate sentences, he describes Captain McNelly's soul as a flame of courage. Early in 1875, McNelly and his men were sent into the infamous Nueces Strip, that portion of Texas lying between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. McNelly's job was to rid the area of cattle thieves, of which there were a great many. He did a brilliant, brave job, and his methods were absolutely ruthless. Any Mexican unlucky enough to be caught was tortured until he coughed up information, then summarily hung. Mexicans found with cattle were shot. In one of his boldest moves, McNelly and his 30 men crossed the Rio Grande to attack a ranch near Las Cuevas, where some 250 Mexican soldiers were assembled. Unfortunately, the Rangers dashed into the wrong ranch and found a number of men working at the woodpile, cutting wood while their wives cooked breakfast. The Rangers shot them down, then realized their mistake and went on to the right ranch. Whether apologies were offered to the wives of the slain woodchoppers is not recorded. Webb is aware that McNelly's methods might conceivably be criticized, but he satisfies himself with the remark that affairs on the border cannot be judged by standards that hold elsewhere. Why they can't is a question apologists for the Rangers have yet to answer. Torture is torture, whether inflicted in Germany, Algiers, or along the Nueces Strip. The Rangers, of course, claimed that their end justified their means, but people who practice torture always claim that. Since the practical end, in this case, was the recovery of a few hundred cattle, one might dispute the claim. Only a generation or two earlier, the Nueces Strip had been Mexico, and it is not inconceivable that some of the Mexicans involved had as good a right to the cattle as Captain Richard King or any other Texas cattleman. Indeed, the Mexicans called them Nanita's cattle, Grandma's cattle. There are places, apparently, where the passage of a century changes very little, and the Texas border is such a place. One gains no popularity there today by suggesting that Mexicans have rights to something other than air, frijoles, and goat's milk. The farm labor disputes of 1967, disputes in which the Texas Rangers played a suspect role, make this very clear. I know a farm manager, a man but recently migrated from the valley to the high plains, who was sincerely shocked by the fact that Mexicans were beginning to want houses to live in. Tents and truck beds, 50 cents an hour cash, and a free goat every week or two no longer satisfied them. They had come to consider themselves human beings, an attitude which filled the manager with astonishment and vague dismay. When Mexicans become thus aberrated, it is time in Texas to call in the Rangers. Webb was aware, of course, that the pacification of the border involved ethical questions that were a good deal more subtle than the Rangers' methods of resolution. The difficulty was that he simply could not bear to think badly of the Rangers. Even when he is forced to discuss the career of a ranger who was an out-and-out bastard, the worst he will say is that the man was not suited to rangering and should not have been hired. In a book of almost 600 pages, he records virtually no instance in which a ranger treats either a Mexican or a Negro as anything but a recognized inferior, and he seems to accept the still common assumption that a ranger can tell whether a Mexican is honest or dishonest simply by looking at him. The same method was used to separate good Negroes from bad. Captain Bill McDonald's famous advance on the Fort Brown rioters in 1906, while no doubt a splendid example of ranger courage, is an equally fine indication of their racial arrogance. McDonald, with one man, advanced on 20 armed men with these words, "You niggers hold up there. I'm Captain McDonald, and I'm down here to investigate a foul murder you scoundrels have committed. I'll show you niggers something you've never been used to." The important point to be made about the Texas Rangers is that in it Webb was writing not as an historian of the frontier, but as a symbolic frontiersman. The tendency to practice symbolic frontiersmanship might almost be said to characterize the 20th century Texan, whether he be an intellectual, a cowboy, a businessman, or a politician. One of the purposes of this book is to explore the ramifications of that tendency. While it may be possible for a novelist to remain a symbolic frontiersman without impairing his art, the same will hardly hold for the historian. I think it is clear that most Southwestern writers, sooner or later, assume that role, and I am not sure that Webb ever quite developed beyond it. But he did, at least, have a firm commitment to intellect, and to intellectual process, which is more than can be said for most of his contemporaries. Indeed, it is more than can be said for either Bedichek or Dobie, both of whom displayed a marked ambivalence toward the intellect. At the end of his career, in the final pages of The Great Frontier, Webb remarks briefly upon his own development. The first step in my preparation to become a student of the frontier was taken in 1892 when my parents moved to West Texas, while that country was still in the frontier stage. All my early impressions were of young families struggling with raw nature. Thus it was that I touched the hem of the garment of the great frontier almost, but not quite, too late. Because my father was a teacher, I had books and became a reader. And as I read, I caught a distorted but alluring vision of another world. At an early age, I determined to escape to that other world and to leave the frontier to those who were more audacious. Eventually, I turned to the frontier as a subject of study, and there I found a body of literature that I could understand, and I found myself, and so I entered the door leading back to the world I had known. Most of the writers who have come out of this region could make a similar statement. As late as the 40s, the hem of the garment of the great frontier could still be touched in rural Texas. Perhaps there are a few places where it could be touched even now. If I were recasting the statement to fit myself, I would first of all change the figure and eliminate the word hem. It suggests the feminine, and the frontier was not feminine, it was masculine. The metropolis, which has now engulfed it, is feminine, though perhaps it is an error to sexualize the process even that much. The metropolis swallowed the frontier like a small snake swallows a large frog, slowly, not without strain, but inexorably. And if something of the frontier remains alive in the innards of the metropolis, it is because the process of digestion has only just begun. In writing this chapter, I have begun to wonder if it is possible to write a discursive book about Texas which will not turn out to be simply a book for Texans, or, more narrowly still, a book for Texas intellectuals. One hopes not, but the doubt is not easily dispelled. In this age of information overload, who but a few Texas writers could possibly need a critique of Roy Bedicek or J. Frank Dobie? The latter has had the largest audience of any Texas writer, but at that it is an audience composed primarily of middle-aged nostalgics, and it will probably not outlive him much more than a generation.